question of the day, buying a primary residence and buying an investment property, is it the same? Is it the same process? Is it different? What puts me in a position where I could qualify for a home? Okay, so let's talk about a couple things first. Qualification on a primary residence, most people know what that's going to take. You got to have your credit, you got to have your income, you got to have your reserves, your down payment, etc. And so as I sit and counsel with people and have since 2005, I actually had a mortgage license for, I think it was 8 years, 2005 to about 2012, so 7 years. Those were the things that we would talk about. When they're looking to buy a home, there's going to be a couple of things that they need to concentrate on. Is they need to be aware of their income, their credit, and then their savings, their reserves, their down payment. Okay, and so here a critical thing to know is debt to income ratio. Here is that they've got on their credit, you've got a score. That's going to be one thing that's important when it comes to credit, is what is the score. But that's not everything. You could have an 800 credit score and still not qualify to buy a home or to do other things, depending on what you're doing with your credit. You've got to have the credit score, the credit length or history, and then the type. The type of credit. And how frequently it's those types are used. So usage, I guess we could call that. Okay, the type and the usage. So we may be going through this, and this may happen often at the Impact School of Money as you're going through these lessons. As you go through, and that's what's so funny sometimes, is we go through things, and it's like, oh, I already knew that. Well, here's the thing. I'm pretty convinced that in life, life is not all about all the stuff you can learn, and that's it. It's if you know something, and you know somebody that needs that something, and I'm not helping them with it, what's the point in learning it? I should be learning it to help others and teach others. Yes, help myself for sure. That's one part. But then it's helping and teaching others how to do it. Okay? And so there's the debt to income ratio, there's the score, or there's our credit, and then there's our savings, right? And this is going to be like where our down payment comes from, or a lot of lenders. They used to do this a lot more. They're kind of, it's funny that the mortgage industry got really, really tightened down after 2008, 2009, and now they're starting to back off a little bit. But some underwriters are still going to look at reserves. But then also, it's just wise, I mean, it's just straight up wisdom, to have reserves. You know, there's a job interruption, we want to have our house payment. If there's you know, something that happens to our home, especially if it's an investment property, we want to have the money to make those adjustments. So a couple of things to know when it comes to, we have our primary residence, which we're not talking about today. When we have an investment property, a couple of numbers really quick. So when it comes to our income, there's a couple of things we need to know. So debt to income ratio means our house payment is what's called the front end debt to income ratio. And then we have all of our debt payments is the back end debt to income ratio. And so there's different numbers when we're trying to qualify for a home, and just to throw some numbers out there, it's around, and if you go back previous episodes of the Impact School of Money, we talk about FHA loans and conventional, and at the time of the recording, what the debt to income ratios are on a primary residence. But if we're talking about getting an investment property, we're looking at a front end being on house payments around 30-ish% would be a good number to run, and then back end about 45. 45%, which could be a whole lesson in and of itself, how ridiculous I think, in my opinion, that is. Especially if you're W-2'd, they allow this number to be, that your house payment could be 30% of what your gross income is. So that's like before taxes come out, and before 401k comes out, and before health insurance comes out. So someone could be making, you know, $3,000, qualify for a $1,000 per month house payment, off they go, but then you look at what they actually get, and they go $3,000 minus taxes, minus health insurance, minus 401k. They're bringing home like $2,100, and their house payment's $1,000. And we allow that, underwriters allow that to happen. Really, it's not them allowing it to happen. It's the person that's buying the house that's allowing that to happen, thinking that that's a good idea. Because they get so caught up in, oh, I got to buy a house because now I'm married. Oh, we had just had a baby, we better buy a house. Oh, we had our second baby, we better buy a house. We graduated, we better buy a house. Our neighbor bought a new house, we better buy a house. People buy a house when a lot of the time they don't need to, or they're not in a good position to qualify. Okay, and so that's if we're W-2'd, they're going to go off gross income. But if we are 1099, the business owner, they're going to go on this, or excuse me, this number, our income number, because they're going to compare our debt to our income. That's what DTI stands for, debt to income ratio. And so W-2, they compare it to our gross income. If we're 1099, they compare it to our after deduction income. So here's what's messed up about that, business owners, is, because I'm talking to me too, is that we pay for a cell phone just like the W-2'd person does. We pay for our car just like the W-2'd person does. They get to pay for their car after tax, after 401k, after health insurance, where they're only bringing in $2,100 a month. $1,000 of it goes to their house payment. So they've got $1,100 left. After they pay for their cell phone, their car, some food, they're out of money, right? Where we get to pay for our car too, and it's a deduction to us. We get to deduct the car payment in the right circumstances. We get to deduct the cell phone. We get to deduct all these things. We're still paying for it, but then when it comes to qualifying for loans, they don't let us count what we make after those, or what we make before those deductions, even though people that aren't business owners pay for those things too. So it's kind of a challenge as a business owner. You've got to either save money in taxes with all your deductions, or be in a better position to qualify for a mortgage, debt, etc. It's kind of a weird thing, yet the business owners are usually the ones making more money and that have their own job, that created their own job, that they're not going to lay themselves off, yet is there some reason that that's riskier than someone having a job and qualifying them at way higher than they should, and then they're probably going to get laid off or downsized or switch companies at some point in their life? To me as an underwriter, that seems pretty volatile too. Not saying that being a 1099 self-employed business owner doesn't have its risks as well. I just think it's kind of an interesting system, but then people are like, well, how do you fix it? That's not what we're talking about today, right? So you have to know that's going to be calculated in. If I'm doing a real estate investment as well, these ratios are still going to apply. But the thing that I get to do now, though, is on my front-end debt to income ratio, my house payment that, say, is $1,200, if my house payment is $1,200, who's making that payment on a primary residence? Me. Is there anything to offset that number? No, unless I rent my basement. Let's say I rent my basement. It's got a good, I buy the house, it has a history of rent. There's a whole other conversation there of what needs to be there. But if I rent out my basement for $800, they apply that to my front-end debt-to-income ratio. Let's say I buy a house that they've been renting the basement for 10 years. I buy the house, I leave the renters in there, I leave the agreement, or I get new renters in there, or whatever ends up happening. My front-end debt-to-income ratio is only $400. That's pretty cool, right? And so the same thing happens with an investment property. If I go and I have a good credit score, and my debt-to-income ratio, back end, front end, is good. I've got a down payment. I'm going to have a bigger down payment to get an investment property than I am on a primary residence. But now what's excuse me, what's unique is that if the house payment of the house that I buy after my down payment, let's say on my investment property, is $1,400, well, am I going to live there? No, it's an investment property. I'm going to rent it out. If I put down, usually what a lot of people will put down in an investment property, if I put down 20% on this investment property, small down payment, and this is going to be what the mortgage payment is, the rent on what a mortgage payment with no down payment, that's about what it is. I'm not going to say that's exactly what it is. You've got to work with somebody that knows rents and knows what to charge and all that stuff. Or maybe you just throw out a number and see how it works. But if this is going to be my house payment, no down payment, and that's about what I'm charging for rent, if I do put a down payment on the investment property, which I have to, there's requirements there. I put, say, 20% down. Now my balance goes down, which means my payment goes down. I should, in the right deal, I go find the right deal out there in the world of real estate, my payment should be here and my rent should be here. You know, and what that gap is, it can be big, it could be small, but the biggest thing, and this is straight out of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, if it doesn't have positive cash flow on the deal, it's not the best deal. Because you've got to figure that you're paying the taxes and the insurance on the house payment. The renters aren't paying for that stuff. They're not paying for improvements. They're not paying for the water heater, the shingles, the whatever. Okay? But the good thing is it shouldn't affect my front or back end debt to income ratio. Why? Because this is what my new payment is, $1,400 on the new property that I just bought. But I'm also charging, let's say that $1,400 is my mortgage payment, but the rent on the property is $1,500 or $1,600 or whatever it is. Okay? Those two things offset themselves, and it's not going to affect that front end debt to income ratio. And then I start charging the rent. It's very wise to have reserves to make sure that there's, you know, if there's a month or two where I don't have a tenant in there and I've got to, you know, make those payments for a little bit. But long term, just like we talked about if you go back and watch previous episodes, the previous episode to this one, is that now, especially if you get the right deal and you're positive cash flowing on that rental, and the value of the home, hopefully, is going to go up, I'm making money in two places. Positive cash flowing per month, value of the property goes up over time. Okay? So, a lot of tax deductions can come with having an investment property as well. So a couple of things to know. One, in comparison to a primary residence, my down payment is going to need to be bigger in an investment property. Small down payment when it comes to a primary residence. If you work with preferred lenders of builders or whatever, a lot of the time, or with certain types of approaches, there's no down payment on a primary residence, depending on the program and the rate and what the mortgage broker is willing to do and all that stuff. I might not need to have a down payment on a primary residence. On an investment property, usually not, almost never the case. At least I've never heard of it. Okay, I'm not a real estate professional. I work with a whole bunch of them. But typically, a 20% down payment is something that should be expected on an investment property. Okay. Also, primary residence, interest rate. If you're looking at interest rates on billboards or on banks or you know a mortgage broker, and they give you what the rate is on a mortgage, they're usually giving you what the rates are on a primary residence, one that you're going to live in. Okay, if I'm going to go and purchase an investment property and I'm getting a loan to purchase the investment property, my interest rate is going to be higher. It's going to be a little bit higher just because it's an investment property. So, a good place to start, and we'll finish with this. A good place to start is you're young, let's say. Maybe you're not young. You get into a home, but this is easier for like getting started, like first time getting into real estate period, is you buy your first home not with the thinking that, hey, I'm going to live here forever, and what do I want in this home because I'm going to live here forever. Well, if you're not going to live there forever, you should approach the home that you're going to live in for the next 3, 4, 5 years is, would this be a good rental once I'm done? Maybe the basement and the upstairs are already separated, you know, have separate entrances and the whole thing, and can be separated that way. Maybe it's got the right amount of bedrooms. Maybe the house, like the house that my wife and I bought 6 years ago, has a kitchen in the basement already. Has a separate entrance that they could get through in the garage, right? So there's certain qualifications in the city or the state that you're in that would qualify it as a rental property. So you got to find out those things. I have a partner that's building a home that's putting on a 4th bedroom. He wishes he could have the vaulted ceiling in the one room, but instead upstairs they're doing that 4th bedroom so that in the future it's a better rental because it'll have more bedrooms. Right? And so if I'm not going to live in the home forever, I can go into it and qualify on a primary residence loan, lower interest rate, lower down payment, less out of pocket. I make the payment for a little bit. Maybe I could rent out the basement. But I make the payment for a little bit. I stay there 4 or 5 years, which I was going to do anyway, even if I bought a house that wasn't rental ready. And then I move out, and it's ready to rent. And then I can keep, by the way, I can keep the primary residence loan on that property, because they're not going to make me reconfigure the loan. I can keep that loan, maybe that lower interest rate. Now I go buy another house. I can qualify for that home on a primary residence loan as well because that's the one I'm going to live in. Okay? Asterisk at the bottom. You cannot have 2 FHA loans at the same time. If my primary residence is on an FHA loan, when I go buy my next home, I can't get an FHA loan on that one. I got to go conventional. Right? So that's our lesson for today. Thank you for joining us at the Impact School of Money, where our mission is to be the way that people are educated about money. My name is Adam Davis. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Class dismissed.